Hundreds of Central American migrants heading for the United States. To get there, they will have to pass through Mexico. How is Mexico dealing with the migrant issue? Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. United States President Donald Trump has new ammunition as he argues for a border wall to stop illegal immigration into the United States. Over the last few days, hundreds have left Honduras and El Salvador and are making their way north towards the United States as part of a new migrant caravan. Their journey will take them through Mexico, a country that also sees thousands of its own people cross into the United States illegally year after year. So how is Mexico dealing with the issue that the U.S. president calls a migration crisis? Joining me now to discuss this is Arturo Sarukhan. He is a former Mexican ambassador to the United States and is an international strategic consultant. Here with us in the studio too is Rafael Bernal. He is the main writer for the Latino section of The Hill newspaper. Joining us from Philadelphia is Michael Johns. He is a former White House speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush and co-founder of the U.S. National Tea Party movement. And also with us is Baverstock. He is a CGTN correspondent based in Mexico City. Welcome to all of you. Alistair, let's start off with this latest new migrant caravan heading north towards the United States. What can you tell us about it?
Well, the latest in terms of news and updates is what we can go through so far is that out of San Pedro Sula, one of the most dangerous towns in all of that Central American northern triangle, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, there is yet another migrant caravan forming. It's anywhere from between 1,500 and 2,000 people, and it's currently on its way through Guatemala, hoping in the next few days to cross Mexico's southern border. And how big it's going to be when it eventually arrives, we cannot really yet say.
How are people actually moving, Alistair?
Well, generally they're moving on foot, which is the only way for a lot of them. They will be hitching rides, trying to hitchhike along their way. One of the things that we talk about when we think of this caravan, we think of great numbers of people moving together. But this is people moving together in numbers, safety in numbers, but it is also every man for himself along the way. So if someone can hitch a ride, they're going to get to the next destination to safety, into the relative safety of towns as fast as possible. So on foot, hitching rides, and when they can, on buses.
Ambassador Sarukhan, much of this migrant story, of course, focuses on the United States-Mexico border. But what is Mexico doing to stop migrants crossing that southern border into Mexico?
That's been at the core of a debate that's been taking place in Mexico for quite some time. It started in 2014, remember, when we had this first important uptick of undocumented young minors, unaccompanied children reaching the border with the United States. That's when the previous U.S. administration asked Mexico to enhance its ability to stop and repatriate many of these Central American migrants. Mexico did so, I must say, with no quid pro quo in hand. Mexico did it at the time without asking for anything back from the U.S. And there are many voices, I think, with a lot of justification in Mexico, who felt that Mexico was basically sending people back, violating the asylum and refugee rights that some of these individuals had when they crossed the border into Mexico. So this tension between how Mexico enhances its operational control of its border while at the same time appearing not to be doing the bidding of the United States is at the core of a debate that is brewing again in Mexico as this new caravan heads towards the Guatemala-Mexico border. Right,
Ambassador, clearly, many of the people entering Mexico are fleeing violence, they're fleeing poverty. You talked a moment ago about refugee status, refugee policy, asylum policy. What is Mexico's policy?
Well, Mexico traditionally, historically, has had a very generous asylum and refugee policy. I'm the result of that. I'm the son and grandson of refugees on both sides of my family who came into Mexico in the 1930s. In the last decade or so, Mexico hasn't quite figured out how to upgrade and revamp its legislation. The pressures that were levied on Mexico by the U.S. administration, the current one and the previous one, have put Mexico in a very tight spot. the new Mexican president, President López Obrador, has been struggling on the one hand as to how it will respond and react and provide everything from visas to working permits to some of these Central American migrants who may stay in Mexico, and at the same time being pressured by the U.S., as we saw a few weeks ago, with this idea of holding on to refugee and asylum claimants heading to the U.S. by keeping them on the Mexican side of the border. That has created a big backlash for the government. And I think this current government is still trying to figure out exactly what the contours of this new migration position and policy are.
All right, let me bring in Michael Johns. He's in Philadelphia. And Michael, you know, this is a raging debate that's going on in the United States. It's a big debate that's going on. There is one body of opinion that says, listen, we have to look at the role that the United States played in creating this crisis in the border right now. And to do that, we have to go a little bit back in history. They look at the role that the United States played in the civil war in El Salvador. They look at the fact that President Obama refused to label a coup, that overthrow of the elected president in Honduras. It even goes back further than that, to 1954, of course, when the CIA interfered in Guatemala's election. Is that a fair accusation? I mean, the people who support that say it left those governments weak and fragile, and it empowered drug cartels and oligarchs.
I think on a macro level, it's true that the conditions of Central America are of direct importance to U.S. interests and to the uncontrolled immigration crisis. Our policy toward Central America over the last few decades, with a few exceptions, has traditionally been designed to foster market economic conditions that would be conducive to economic growth, to support and foster democratic political institutions in the region. We have many organizations that are supported by the U.S. government, by the State Department, by Agency for International Development that have been designed to do that. We just authorized over $5 billion in developmental aid for Mexico, which is hopefully going to be hugely helpful in the southern tier of the country and in managing their uncontrolled migration challenges. I also think for the same reasons that we've made an argument for a border wall in the United States, the border wall between Mexico and Guatemala is existent, but could likely be strengthened. And that would offer an opportunity, I think, for Mexico to have a more controlled migration plan. There's a lot of very malevolent forces that have been resisting that, drug cartels, trafficking individuals, and others who have a stake in illegal immigration. But illegal immigration is not helping anyone in the hemisphere. It's important to point out the same arguments we've made are equally applicable to Mexico and to Central America.
Okay, Ambassador, you want to respond to that?
Just to clarify, there is no border wall between Mexico and Guatemala.
They do have barriers between Mexico and Guatemala.
Being a jungle, absolutely, of course. But in terms of
there are no physical barriers on the southern border of Mexico with
federal
Guatemala.
police patrols. There are migration patrols who pick up and know the migration routes through Guatemala into Mexico. But in terms of a solid wall,
there's nothing.
Doesn't exist.
Okay, I want to move on.
There's not a solid wall, no.
All right, Rafael, what happens to the thousands of people who are already in Mexico trying to come into the United States? What's their status right now?
Well, the caravan is actually sort of good news, considering what happened in 2014, for instance, with unaccompanied children, where the human smugglers had a lot more control over these groups that were trying to hide. They were trying to pass inadvertently through Mexico, and that gave, of course, organized crime a lot more power over them. So today, when it's almost like a gift to the Mexican and American governments where you have an organized group that tells you where it's going to be. It makes planning so much easier. But of course, the Trump administration isn't taking it that way. They're interpreting the existence of a new caravan as another argument for the border barrier, of course, on Mexico's northern border in this case.
Right. Alistair, you've been covering this area, you've been reporting from there, and we hear often about the violence in Central American countries, gang-related violence, drug violence, poverty in these areas. What are conditions like there?
Well, conditions in Central America, particularly in the two countries, El Salvador and Honduras, are essentially like a war zone. They have extremely high rates of murder, And what you essentially have are two gangs known as the Maras down there. You have the Mara Salvatrucha, who Trump often talks about, and then you have the Barrio 18, which is more or less translates as the 18th neighborhood. Now, these two gangs are extremely violent, and they make a lot of their profits from drugs moving through this region. But they also, in terms of making money, they turn to extorting a lot of local people, because it becomes a territory war. So I've been in places in El Salvador and Honduras where villages which are separated by 2 kilometers, one is controlled by the Mara Salvatrucha, the other is controlled by the 18. And in these places, after dark, you cannot possibly move between these two places, and it's hard even to leave your house, because if the Maras, who are essentially frontline soldiers in these individual villages, they are frontline soldiers, and they see someone who they don't recognize in the street, their instincts are going to be violent because of the violence that they have already lived through and the violence that has led them to be gangsters in the first place. So it's extremely violent, and in addition to this, in order to fund this war, there's what's known down there as a war tax, which is an extortion. If you own a shop or a business or anything like that, you're expected to pay these Maras a weekly quota, which funds their war. So unemployment, massive poverty, and real violence. And this is one of the things which I think has been misunderstood throughout the coverage of this caravan, is that these migrants don't want to leave. They want to stay in their home countries. They simply can't. A migrant doesn't want to leave the beaches of El Salvador, make a month, 4,000-kilometer, incredibly dangerous passage across Mexico to reach the US border, and then when they reach the US border, just sit in limbo waiting to get into the United States. These people don't want to be leaving.
Right, this begs one question, Alistair, and if you could be brief, please. Where are the police?
Where are the police? Well, the police, in many cases, are corrupted by those same cartels. A police officer in El Salvador or Honduras will earn perhaps $300–400 a month. So if they're earning $300– $400 and some gangster comes along and says, I'm going to give you $1,000, but you look the other way when I'm doing what I'm doing, and if you don't, there's going to be violent consequences for you, what decision are you going to take?
Right. Ambassador, there are 12 million Mexican immigrants in the United States. These are figures from the Pew Research Organization. Less than half, in fact, 45% are here illegally. Yep. Pew also says that the number of illegal Mexicans who've been coming into the United States is actually on the way down. They point to the fact that it's 1 million less than it was in 2007. So something happened there to reduce that number.
Well, Mexican migration to the United States hit a net zero around 2010. And in fact, there are some who believe that it's now negative, that more Mexicans are going back than those that actually come over into the United States. There are a series of factors that explain this. Number one is that Mexico, despite its sluggish 2.4, 2.3 annual average growth, has been creating jobs, has been anchoring more women and men in Mexico. Second, the border has become much more dangerous because organized crime has muscled its way into the business of smuggling and trafficking of people across the border. Third, it is a much more patrolled and secure border, much more presence, so it becomes much harder to cross. So all of these factors, I think, started playing a role as of 6–7 years ago. But what you point is very important. This is why, despite a alternative fact universe, which we live in apparently in DC these days, hard data and facts do matter. Number of Mexicans coming illegally across the border has collapsed. It's going down. The absolute numbers of people detained on the border or surrendering to the Border Patrol, which is the case of the majority of these Central American migrants. They're not trying to smuggle, they're not trying to cross the border illegally. They're trying to find U.S. authorities to surrender to, and then start, obviously, the asylum or refugee processes. So, you know, this argument that there is a national security crisis on the border with Mexico, this crazy piece of data that was thrown out there by the White House, by the White House spokesperson, saying that last year there had been 4,000 terrorists caught trying to cross the border into Mexico, which was very quickly debunked, is part of the problem. there has to be a discussion as to how Mexico and the United States work together, as we have done so since 2001, after terrorist attacks. But it has to be done on real data, on real facts, and not on fear-mongering and dog whistle politics.
You'd have to add one thing. The size and shape of the demographic pyramids in Mexico and Central America compared to the United States, sort of the labor market that creates, 18 to 25-year-olds looking for that sort of labor, has been a very important factor and was a huge factor in that mass migration that happened from the mid-90s to the late 2000s from Mexico.
Okay. Michael Johns, the Trump administration, they've come in for a lot of criticism on the manner in which they've been handling this migrant crisis on the border. You know, you look at the forced separation of families, children taken away, kept in camps at the border. Is there a more humane way for this administration to handle this crisis?
Well, realizing they're guided essentially by congressional statute, which is one of the reasons the president correctly has been calling for an overhaul of a lot of these policies. You know, statistically, I think it's important also to emphasize that one of the many problems of illegal immigration is that we don't know precisely, or even in a good guesstimate, the number of illegals that are in this country, the number that are, or where they're located. Anyone who says that they know that is guessing. That's the very nature of illegal immigration. Could be 12 million, could be 20 million, could be more than that. The position of the administration, of course, is that there's a number of core areas here that need to be reformed. The chain migration issue, the border security itself, the issue of point of birth, birthright citizenship. These are all areas that make no
Michael,
sense
I just want to clarify
something.
Yeah, I just want to clarify something that you said at the beginning. You know, I was talking about the separation of children taken away from their parents at the border. That's not mandated by Congress, is it?
Well, yes, the administration is not permitted to detain children for over 30 days with the parents. So in essence, you're left with you're left with very bad choices, which is what statutorily requires children, and this was the position of the Obama administration as well, statutorily requires the separation of children from their parents.
Yeah, but those are parents who have committed crimes.
But there's well, the very entry of the United States illegally is a crime. You may not view it as a serious one, but it is one. Okay. And the first thing that needs to be done with those people need to be detained. They need to be assessed. There's public health issues. Right. They need to be given court dates to reappear if they're going to try to appeal for amnesty status.
All right, Rafael?
There's a lot to unpack there. First of all, the estimate that there's 10.7 million undocumented immigrants in the country is actually a very well-respected estimate. There was a study recently
it's a lot. Who knows?
Came out.
Who knows?
The study came out with 20 million, and the reason that didn't gain any traction with people who want reduced undocumented illegal immigration is because if there were 20 million undocumented immigrants in the country, then their crime rate would be half of what we're registering. So you have a certain number of crimes committed by the entire undocumented population. If there's 10 million, it's a pretty low rate. If there's 20 million, it's a super low rate. So
well, we know what the crime rates are, though. We know what the crime rates are. 266,000 illegals charged and convicted of violent crimes over the last 2 years. 266,000. Over 20% of our Bureau of Federal Prisons is comprised of illegal aliens.
Well, that's a statistic that's difficult because a lot of people in federal prison are in there not for crimes related to their immigration status.
No, that excludes immigration. These are violent crimes.
Okay.
These are not immigration crimes, violent crimes.
All right, I'm going to move on to some of the solutions that are being looked at, some of the fixes. Alistair, I want to ask you about this. You know, we talk about the problems that these Central American countries have: poverty, drug-inspired violence, gang violence, etc. What are those governments doing about that?
Well, in terms of the Central American government's reaction, as I mentioned, they're fairly weak in what they can actually do about these problems. These gangs are so out of hand by this point that they've managed to corrupt a lot of the on-the-ground forces. So in terms of what the Central American governments can do, it's rather difficult when we're at this late sort of development stage in organized crime down there. One of the things which I suppose is inspiring something of change is that Trump himself has threatened to cut aid to these Central American countries. Just how much of a problem that can be, you know, outside of the capital, Tegucigalpa and San Salvador. Yeah. It's not their problem, really. Right. So what we have seen from the Central American migrants, from the Central American governments, has been sort of, they can't stop people from leaving. These countries aren't prisons. Yeah. So within the caravans themselves, there are unaccompanied children, which these governments are saying, well, we can filter these out and possibly put them into a place where they're not having to cross Mexico, which is an incredibly dangerous thing to do. But then, in that way, a lot of these children themselves have been neglected so much by the state that they themselves have been orphaned by these gangs, that their parents have been caught up in this violence. And so when it comes to Central American governments, a key thing that they're going to have to do now is ensure that those children are put down the right life paths, because those orphan children left on the streets of San Salvador are the most likely people who to eventually turn into gangsters. Yeah,
they would be very vulnerable. Ambassador, if we look at Mexico, Mexico has a new president. What would you like to see from the new president, specifically on this issue?
I'd like this president and this government to devise their own paradigm for what migration policy needs to look like. On the one hand, a forward-looking policy that takes into account labor mobility and allows for the orderly, legal, transparent flow of people who want to work in Mexico for several months and then want to go back, provide them with working visas, with jobs, with permits, so that mobility, that circular mobility, is transparent, legal, and safe. On the other hand, Mexico does need to enhance its operational control over its southern border with Guatemala. It is too porous. We are a partner with Canada and the U.S. in the security of North America. We need to develop a North American common domain awareness paradigm, because we are, the security of North America is critically important. It starts on the southern border with Guatemala. That's why Mexico and Canada, after 9/11, started sharing, for example, the passenger manifestos, the lists of every single plane that flies into Mexican airspace is shared in real time with U.S. authorities to ensure that anyone who's on a terrorist watch list isn't trying to come in to Mexican territory or isn't visa shopping, having been denied a visa in the U.S. or in Canada, and then trying to make their way into Mexico.
Okay, very quickly, Ambassador, there was one proposal which was reported by the New York Times just over a month ago from the new president in Mexico, and this was reported last month before I think he was actually inaugurated. But he was looking at some kind of a deal with the United States where there'd be a comprehensive development plan at source, to fix the problem at source. Will it work?
I don't know. I think given the lay of the land in Washington and in the U.S. today, it seems to be very hard to see this playing out. But I think the U.S. administration should take the observador up for this, because it is the first time the Mexican government is speaking about a comprehensive investment plan for Central America that will enhance human security, institutional resilience, and economic well-being. If the U.S. can partner with Mexico, and maybe others, Canada, Colombia, to enhance the resilience, the security, the economic development in these three countries, down the road, this is going to be the most effective tool to change transmigration dynamics into the United States through Mexico.
Right. People don't want to be leaving. They don't want to leave these countries.
Right. Michael Johnson, what are your thoughts on that plan that has been floated by the Mexican president, that both countries, the United States and Mexico, develop a plan that would help the countries of Central America keep people back there? I mean, of course, the United States Congress would have to be involved as well, because they would be the people voting the money for this plan. Do you think it could work?
Right. It has to be looked at seriously. And, Mexico ultimately has a decision to make. They're either going to have to control their southern border completely in the ways that we're trying to get done here in the United States, or they're going to have a plan, as they have shown some indication to actually do, to assimilate mass numbers of refugees into their country. Because even under U.S. amnesty law, a Honduran, a Guatemalan, a Salvadoran who is, entering the U.S. and it was supposed to have claimed asylum in the first country of arrival. So in theory, there had to be an effort within Mexico to have done that, and Mexico, at least in these recent months under this administration, has proven fairly cooperative in granting that. But there has to be an effort, and there has to be education regarding that opportunity that's afforded Central American migrants.
There is one thing that I would say, that if America wants to stop these people moving en masse in caravans, I would say one thing which would be a good way to stop these mass migrations would be for Donald Trump to stop tweeting about them. Because a lot of the people who I spoke to in this previous caravan, which arrived there in November, which was made up of some 10,000 people, a lot of the people I spoke to said, I only joined the caravan when I saw this turning into a big news story. Because I was on the fence about whether to go. Crossing Mexico as a solo migrant is incredibly dangerous. Around 2% of people who cross Mexico's southern border reach the US border when they're traveling alone. When they're traveling in caravans, they move much more safely, and a far greater percentage of people arrive. So a lot of people who are on the fence about leaving, they're suffering at home, but they don't want to leave. But they see this snowballing into a big story because of the reaction, the furious reaction from the administration. They say, now's the time to go. I will be safe. I'm going to give it a shot.
Yeah, Rafael, there was a piece in the New Republic which said that, in a sense, President Trump has outsourced the migrant crisis to Mexico. In fact, that piece said that, reported that the burden President Trump is foisting on Mexico is unprecedented.
It's true, and the relationship between this president, AMLO, López Obrador, and Trump is a very stark contrast to his predecessor, Peña Nieto. Under Peña Nieto, there was a very big Mexican effort to sort of get on Trump's good side, and there was relatively little action to do that. There was a White House connection through Jared Kushner, which was presumed to have kept the peace there. But López Obrador has basically taken Trump at his word, and I'm not sure if it's going to be effective long term, but it's produced some very interesting results so far.
Ambassador, very quickly.
That bubble may pop sooner than we think, because I think there will be structural tensions in that conversation. But I think that at the end of the day, this whole debate has to be centered on whether this wall is the right solution to 21st century problems.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. Thanks for being with us.